Well, good evening to everyone. Welcome again to the services. Last month or the month before, on one of my Wednesday nights, I went through the book of Genesis and said that I'm going to try about once a month maybe, or maybe a little bit more, just depends on when I speak on Wednesday nights probably, but I'm going to start using my Wednesday nights for the most part to do some overviews of the books of the Bible. So these will be generic studies. If you were here for the study over Genesis, you know that we got through the entire book of Genesis in one sermon, which it's a long book and there's a lot there, so we had to skip over a lot or just summarize a lot. And the same is going to be true for Exodus and really all the books that we have an opportunity to go over. But I hope that these kind of high-level overview type of studies are helpful, and I hope that they're interesting. I hope that they maybe encourage you or help you get a better grasp of some of the books, especially in the Old Testament, and their primary message and the way that they're put together. And I hope that might lead to a foundation if you want to go back and then study these books for yourself in more detail. But tonight we come to the second book of the Bible, and that is the book of Exodus. Now, this is a book that most of us are pretty familiar with, or at least we're familiar with some of the major parts of this book of Exodus, but I hope that we have a good study tonight from this book. So we'll just start out kind of the same things that we talked about last time. First of all, as we talk about the book and the title of the book of Exodus is actually a little bit unique. Most of the books that we have in the Old Testament, the title comes from the first word or the first few words that we have in the text. That was the Hebrew way of titling a book. For example, the book of Genesis, that is the very way that book opens, in the beginning. That is the word Genesis, and so it's a fit title. Now, the book of Exodus, we actually get the title that we have in our modern Bibles, in our English Bibles, is taken from the Greek and later Latin Bibles. The Septuagint, that is a Greek translation, was a Greek translation of the Old Testament. So it wasn't the original Hebrew, but a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. In the Septuagint, it changed it a little bit and didn't use just the opening phrase, but it used this word exodos, which means a going out or a departure. And so when the Greek translation, the Septuagint, was created, they titled the book of Exodus after really the prominent event that takes place in the book, and that is the Exodus, or the departure, the going out from Egypt. And we'll talk about that. I think we all know what that's speaking of, but we'll talk about that here more in just a bit. Also, who wrote the book of Exodus? Well, we talked about just the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible, I believe last time, because the first 5 books of the Bible traditionally are all ascribed to Moses. In fact, there are times that you find, and later on in other parts of Scripture in the New Testament, it referring to Moses and the prophets, or the law and the prophets and the law of Moses. And these first 5 books of the Bible all fall under that category of the Pentateuch. Pentateuch meaning 5 books, or the Torah. And now while Genesis just kind of is assumed to be written by Moses, there are some direct evidence, there's some passages that speak about the Lord saying to Moses, write this. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. Exodus 34:27, the Lord said to Moses, write these words, for in accordance with these words I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. And so in Exodus, we have some specific times when God is telling Moses, write these words. And so Moses is most likely, or almost certainly, the author. Or when we say that, we know, or I hope we know, that means Moses is the penman, but God is, of course, the author of this book. The geography of Exodus, I like to go over this just to help us kind of get a lay of the land, so to speak. If you remember, when we talked about Genesis, it covered really a bigger part of the world, or the geographic movement. But Abraham came over to the land of Canaan, and then of course there was his son Isaac and Jacob. But then during the latter years of Jacob's life, there was the famine. Of course, Joseph had been sold into slavery down into Egypt by his brothers. His father thinks that he's dead. And then the famine comes, just as God had foretold through the dreams to Pharaoh that Joseph interpreted. And so at the very end of the book of Genesis, Jacob and his family all moved down to Egypt, and they are put in this area of Goshen. Now, they're on good terms with Egypt at that point, but we're going to pick up at that same point in Egypt, just several years later when we come to the book of Exodus. And so much of the book of Exodus is going to take place in Egypt, and then I've got two mountains here. I'll explain that a little while later. But Moses is going to flee down to Midian. This is the area of Midian. And then when he returns to Egypt and brings the Israelites out, he's going to be somewhere in this area. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. As we talk about the timeline, you might remember from Genesis, we said Genesis covers more historical period than any of the other book of the Bible because it covers a few thousand years. Well, the timeline of Exodus doesn't cover nearly as much history. It still covers quite a bit, but not nearly as much. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that from the end of the book of Genesis, when Joseph dies, until the birth of Moses, until the time that the book of Exodus begins, is roughly 400 years. In fact, to put that in perspective, that's the same amount of time, roughly, from the end of Malachi, the last prophet, until the time of John the Baptist. That time between the Old Testament and the New Testament is roughly 400 years. And you've got roughly the same amount of time between the death of Joseph and where we pick up in the book of Exodus. So it's not like you turn from Genesis, the end of Genesis, onto Exodus, and you're just in the next day or the next week. You're 4 centuries in the future, or 4 centuries beyond where we end the book of Genesis. Now, what Genesis covers very rapidly is the early life of Moses and Moses in Midian, and that's 80 years. Now, so we have just a few chapters, a few introductory comments about how Moses is delivered from Egypt's a plan to try and kill all the Hebrew children, and he spends his upbringing in the house of Pharaoh, and so he's brought up as a prince of Egypt in a sense until he's about 40 years old, and then he sees an Egyptian beating the Hebrew. He kills the Egyptian and has to flee, and he goes to Midian, and there he meets Jethro, a man named Jethro. He marries that man's daughter. Jethro is a priest in Midian, and he spends another 40 years shepherding Jethro's flocks there in Midian. And then we pick up, and really the rest, so that's all very quick in the book of Exodus, and then the rest of the book of Exodus probably takes several months or a year, or maybe just a little bit more than a year before we get to the end of the book of Exodus. Now, for an outline of the book, just to have kind of the high-level view of how we can break the book up, we have chapters 1 through 18 make a segment, and then chapters 19 through 40 make another segment. And chapters 1 through 18 are talking about Israel. This is the Exodus. This is the departure. So it is kind of interesting. The book's named after the prominent event, and it's probably the exciting event, the plagues and Israel going out of Egypt. But that's actually less than half of the book. It's almost half, but a little less, is Israel leaving Egypt. And you see those other breakdowns. We have Israel and Egypt, kind of the prologue to the story, the call of Moses, setting up Moses as the deliverer, and then chapters 5 through 14, the chapters we're the most familiar with, that's the 10 plagues, and then the journey out of Egypt to Mount Sinai. And when we get to Mount Sinai, we're going to come to kind of a grinding halt of geographic movement for quite a while, for at least a year in the biblical narrative, because the Israelites are going to camp at Mount Sinai. And that's the rest of the book of Exodus is going to talk about Israel at Mount Sinai as the laws given, Israel's idolatry with the golden calf and the renewal of the covenant, and then the building of the tabernacle. And then Leviticus is going to pick up with the building of the tabernacle still there at Mount Sinai, with God giving the rest of the law. And then it won't be until a little ways into Numbers that the Israelites finally set out from Mount Sinai to head to the land of Canaan. So that's an outline. Let's just go ahead and jump in. And from here, we're just going to give an overview of the book. We'll go through these chapters. As I've already mentioned, Israel and Egypt is chapter 1. Now, remember in Genesis 46, God said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not, and he's saying this to Jacob, do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. And I bring that up because it's important to see God's promises coming true as we read the Bible. God had told Jacob when that it was okay to go down to see Joseph and to stay with Joseph. And he'd also promised this to Abraham, that Abraham's descendants were going to become a nation down in Egypt. And the Bible tells us that when Jacob goes to Egypt, that his family numbers 70 people. Now that's a big family. That's a really big family to most of us. But 70 people is not a nation. I guess it's bigger than a few towns I've seen, but not very many. But it's certainly not a nation. But now we go forward 400 years and we are in the book of Exodus. And a lot of things have changed. The pharaohs, obviously, that lived during the time of Joseph and Jacob, he's died. And another few pharaohs have come and gone. And the pharaoh that lives now, he does not remember those good relations. And one of the reasons that there's poor relations between Egypt and Israel is because Israel has gone from a 70-member family into truly a nation in that part of the world. In fact, when we get to the book of Numbers and we get the census of the people, the fighting men, and this doesn't even include the tribe of the Levites, is over 600,000 men. So we can, if you assume, basically a wife for most of those men and children for many of those men, it's a conservative estimate that the Israelites now number somewhere between 2 and 3 million people. So Jacob comes to Egypt with 70 members in his family, and the book of Exodus comes, and now Israel numbers in the millions. God had fulfilled his promise. He had done exactly what he told Jacob would do. And even though there was some adversity mixed in, and it's even the growth that makes the Egyptians begin to fear Israel because they're becoming so numerous, they think, well, if they ever want to overthrow us, they're getting big enough that they'll be able to. And so they put them into forced hard labor to make them subservient. But they had become a nation, just as God had promised that they would. But like I said, unfortunately, Egypt saw that as a threat. And so Egypt did everything, and Pharaoh did everything he could to keep the Israelites subservient. In fact, it even got so bad that not only did they enslave the Israelites, but they tried population control. And they began to pass edicts that male children were supposed to be killed and slaughtered or thrown into the Nile to die, to try and keep the numbers of the Israelites down. And it's in that scene, that deplorable situation. And think about that. Now, it's hard for us to really imagine the tragedy because we know the rest of the book of Exodus. But try and forget the rest of the book of Exodus right now and think, okay, God has kept his promise to make the people a nation as far as numbers go. They number a lot more than the 70 people that came to Egypt as, but they're enslaved. They're not prospering. They're in Egypt. They're not in the land that God had promised to Abraham. And now, even though they've grown for quite a while, now their sons are being killed by the Egyptians, or they're supposed to be being killed. This doesn't seem like the prosperity that God had promised to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. And so it would be a devastating situation, and their hope had to be for deliverance. And it's in the depths of despair that a deliverer comes in the form of Moses. And Exodus 2 through 4 tells us the story of Moses. How Moses, his parents loved him, and they were righteous people. They weren't going to kill their son, but they also couldn't keep him hidden forever. And so his mother does the best thing she can. She prepares a basket and covers it with pitch, and she puts him in the Nile River. And his sister watches him. And I think by providence, this basket finds its way up or down the river to where Pharaoh's daughter was. And she sees this basket, and she takes pity on the child. Her father may be a heartless man, but she's not a heartless person. And she takes this child, and she's going to raise this child. And again, God's providence, and also the wits of Moses' mother to send his sister, she comes out of the rushes at the perfect time and asks this woman if she needs a wet nurse for the child. And she says yes. And she goes off, and who gets to raise Moses for several years? Well, Moses' mother. But a time comes, he has to be sent back to Pharaoh's daughter's household. And there he's raised up from a child, and he gets to grow up while the rest of his countrymen are suffering in slavery. He's going to be raised in Pharaoh's household. But that didn't ruin Moses. It would have ruined a lot of people, but it didn't ruin Moses. And we don't know why or how Moses came to have such a sympathy for his people. But we're told that later on, when he's about 40 years old, he goes out and he visits his people. He goes to see his people. And he's moved with compassion. He doesn't want to be in Pharaoh's house anymore, and he doesn't want his people to be enslaved anymore. And he sees the harsh treatment because he sees an Egyptian that's beating an Israelite. And Moses kills the Egyptian. I'm not here to do a study on that. I don't think that was right of Moses to do. Moses didn't have the right to kill that man, but he did. Now, the next day, he sees two Israelites fighting, and he doesn't kill one. He tries to separate them and tries to say to them, don't fight, quit this fighting. Well, one of them says, who made you a judge over us? That's got to be one of the most ironic lines in the Bible, because God was going to make him a judge over them. But he says, are you going to kill me like you did the Egyptian? And so Moses knows it's known. He thought he'd gotten away with murder, but he hadn't. And he knows if these Hebrews know, then the word has probably gotten out. And it had gotten out. And Pharaoh was going to seek Moses' life. So Moses has to run. And he flees from Egypt. And he goes down to Midian. As I said earlier, he meets a priest there named Jethro. And he marries this man's daughter. And he's there for 40 years. And then after about 40 years, around 40 years later, so Moses is now close to or 80 years old, we have the burning bush incident. Moses sees a burning bush one day while he's out tending the sheep, but while it's on fire, it's not consumed. There's something miraculous about this. And he goes and he meets God. God speaks to him from the burning bush. And I don't have the time to go through all of that. One thing that I'll highlight is just how interesting this scene is when we're talking about one of the greatest leaders in all of history, and especially one of the greatest leaders of God's people. And you look at how he began. It's really not the greatest beginning. It's not really the resume that you'd want to put forward, because God has come to Moses and is telling Moses to go back to Egypt so that he can deliver the Israelites. And Moses doesn't seem to want anything to do with it. The man who once was willing to kill an Egyptian is now not willing to go. And he makes excuse after excuse. He says, who am I? That would have been a pretty good question to ask before he took the life of another man. Who am I to take the life of another man? But now that God's commissioned him, he says, well, who am I to go? Well, God's response is one of the greatest responses. I will be with you. Now, that's kind of a sermon right there in and of itself. Who am I to spread the gospel? Why would people listen to me? Why would people listen to you? Why would people listen to any of us about the gospel? Well, it's not our gospel. It's the Lord's gospel. And God is with us, and He's given us His word, and it's not us. Now, we have to go, and we have to preach, and we have to teach, and we have to be the lights. But it's the power of the gospel that converts people, not us. And Moses, it wasn't Moses that had to go deliver the people. It was God who was going to deliver the people. But He was going to use Moses. And so that's no excuse. Who should I tell them sent me? And God says, tell them I am. What if they won't believe me? And God gives him several miracles. He can throw his staff down and it becomes a serpent. He hasn't put his hand in his cloak and pull it out and it's leprous, and he puts it back in and pulls it out and it's whole. So he gives him these signs and these miracles that are going to prove to the Israelites he's sent by God, but Pharaoh will be another matter. Well, that's still not enough. Now, I would think after the miracles, most people by now should be ready to go. But then Moses says, I'm not eloquent. God says, I will teach you what to say. There's another great lesson right there. We have to learn and we have to listen. But one of the wonderful things about preaching the gospel is it's not up to us. We don't have to be clever and figure out all the ways to convince people of the gospel. God has taught us what to say. We just need to speak where God has spoken and teach the word faithfully. It doesn't matter if we're eloquent. It's nice to listen to an eloquent, dynamic speaker. But that's not what converts souls. It's the power of the gospel. And Moses' excuse that I'm not eloquent was not an excuse for him to be silent. It's not an excuse for me or you to be silent. But we also need to learn to rely upon what God teaches us. And then finally, Moses essentially says, please send someone else. And God says, Aaron will go with you. He didn't get off the hook. Finally, God just says, you're going. Now, I'll send help, and your brother Aaron is going to go with you. But you're going to go. And thank God that He sent Moses. Again, when you read this, you wouldn't think that the rest of the story is going to turn out the way it does. But God knew what he was doing. God knew who he was sending, and he knew who Moses could be. And how thankful we should be that Moses finally went. Well, Moses goes down, and in chapters 5 through 14, we have what I like to call God versus Egypt. And Moses goes down, and he speaks to the people, and he speaks to Pharaoh, and there's sermons and all of this, so we're not going to go into all of the details, but we know, you know most of the story, you know the story, how Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He will not let the children of Israel go. He won't let them leave Egypt. And so God begins to send plagues. He starts off with turning the water of the Nile River into blood. And they get sick of that after a while, but it still doesn't change Pharaoh's mind. And so then God sends frogs, and then he sends gnats or lice, and then he sends flies. Then he kills their livestock. Now by this point, none of these things are affecting the Israelites. Their livestock aren't hurt at this point. And then you'd think that they would have learned their lesson. They're only halfway at this point. There's these unhealable boils. And then it starts getting really scary. You have hail and fire. You have swarms of locusts. You have days of darkness. And I'm sure at this point, in fact, even Pharaoh's advisors at a certain point, see, they were, and I don't have the time to get into all the theories behind how they were able to do this, but there were a few of these that they were able to mimic. Whether God allowed them to truly mimic them, or whether it was some form of trickery and deceit and deception, I don't know. But there came a point where it was obvious. And the magicians of Pharaoh said, look, this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart stayed hardened. And he wouldn't let the children of Israel go. Until finally God brought one final plague. And before this he instituted the Passover. But this final plague was going to be the death of the firstborn. Now the Israelites were told how it was that they could survive the night. Now the angel of death was going to visit them too if they didn't listen. But they were to take that blood and to spray it and to put it on their doorposts. And they were told how to observe the Passover meal. But God said, and part of the Passover was, it symbolized haste. Part of why they were to eat unleavened bread and to eat the lambs the way they were was because they were getting to go. And it wasn't going to take a couple of weeks to move out. After this night happened, they were going to be on their way. And so they left. Now, one of the things that some people try and do is, and people have seen it, it's kind of interesting, the Egyptians had all sorts of gods. Like the Greeks and the Romans, they had a plethora of gods. Gods for this and a god for that. And so some of these, they would have had God symbolized by some of these. And it would have been a direct affront to this God or that God. And I've seen people try and go through and try and pick out which God each of the plagues kind of conquered. But a lot of that speculation, and more than that, again, all these plagues would have actually affronted and offended the sensibilities of the Egyptians concerning many gods. And this wasn't God taking on one or two of the false gods. God himself says in Exodus 12, verse 12, I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. God wasn't combating Ra or one of the other specific gods. God was showing there wasn't a single one of the Egyptian gods that was true. There is one God, and he showed who he is through those plagues in Egypt. He both delivered his people and he executed judgment. And by the way, that's a theme that will carry the rest of the way through the Bible, and it's a theme that's going to be carried out on the great judgment day of Christ. That God will always redeem and save his people. But there is never redemption and salvation of his people without judgment on those who are not his people. It will happen later with the Israelites and with the tribes of Judah. And it will happen one day when Jesus comes back to take his children home, but to judge those who are guilty of sin, to be guilty forever. But as we go on from here, when the children of Israel leave, they plunder the Egyptians. The Egyptians line up And the women are taking off their jewelry. They're giving them jewelry. They're giving them silver and gold. They are giving them anything they need because they want these people out. They are willing to not have their slaves any longer, just so long as they go away. They're going to all die, they feel like, if the Israelites don't go. Now, I mentioned earlier I had these two mountains up here, and I put this because there's a few different theories about where Mount Sinai is. The traditional view is that the Israelites leave Goshen, come down somewhere here. This is called the Sinai Peninsula. And somewhere around here is believed to be Mount Sinai. And the Israelites came down and would have crossed maybe around here, somewhere along this part of the Red Sea, and then traveled on down to Mount Sinai. And that's very possible. Like I said, that's typically the traditional view. Now, another view, and I tend to kind of actually believe the second view, but it's not really paramount, is that the Israelites came down and were around here when Pharaoh marches against them. Now, if they're down here, then they're truly trapped. There's no way to go. If they're only here, they could at least keep going south. It's out of the way, but they could keep running. But here they are truly trapped. There is some archaeological evidence that it may have been right around here. There's some things that have been found in that area of the Red Sea. So I can't get off into all of that, but you can research that on your own sometime. And so it's possible that they came down here. This is where they're trapped. And of course, the Israelites by this point are throwing up their hands in despair, and they think that they're going to die. And they're angry at Moses for bringing them out here. But God works an incredible miracle and parts the Red Sea. And the Israelites cross over on dry land. Now Pharaoh has given chase. He's decided he doesn't want his slave force gone, no matter what it cost him. And this, by the way, shows you how hard-hearted sin can make you. It sounds preposterous, but it's no more preposterous than us when we continue in sin unabated. But here's Moses or Pharaoh, who's already suffered 10 plagues, seen the hand of God obviously at work. He's been held back that night by a pillar of fire that had to be terrifying to see. And now he's sitting there looking at a sea that is supernaturally separated. And the Israelites are going through. And this guy has the genius idea to go through himself. I don't know anybody who would make that silly of a decision. But he did. Why? Because he was hard-hearted, because he was rebellious, because he was stiff-necked, and he didn't want God to have God's way. Pharaoh wanted it to go his way. Well, that's preposterous. But it's just as ridiculous when we know the truth, and we've seen the truth, and we've heard the truth, and we still reject the truth because we want our pleasure or we want our way. It may be less dramatic, but it's just as foolish. And if we continue in it, it's just as deadly. Pharaoh made the fatal mistake. He and his armies were drowned because the Israelites crossed over. And they're still in between those walls of water. And when the last Israelite steps across, God lets those waters crash back over those Egyptians. And there goes Pharaoh and all of his chariots that were with him. Well, with that, Egypt is left behind. But there's a problem. From this point on, now it's the Israelites who prove to be the stiff-necked and the rebellious people. They complain, and chapters 15 through 18 talk about the journey to Mount Sinai, and there's multiple times they complain. They come to a place where the water is bitter, and they complain against Moses that he's brought them out of Egypt. Now, again, how silly is that? They've seen the hand of God at work as much as Pharaoh had, and they come across a place where there's no water that's drinkable, and they say, we want to go back to Egypt. Well, God makes the water drinkable for them. Then they get to the point where they're out of food, and they complain again, so God sends them miraculous manna from heaven. And then they come to a place where there's no water, and they complain again, and Moses is told to strike a rock, and the water comes out. And this is just the beginning. These are the first 3 of what I believe will be 10 total times that the Israelites will complain against God. And again, before we get too judgmental, Paul knew that we needed to learn from that because he uses this in the book of Numbers as a lesson in 1 Corinthians 10, and his conclusion is, let us take heed lest we fall, and let us not grumble and complain like they did, and many of them perished for it. But this brings us to the break in the book of Exodus. In the first 18 chapters are a wonderful story of what God did for Israel. That is how he delivered them. But now that he has delivered them, now he's going to begin to show them what he expected from them. The rest of this is going to be about God's covenant with Israel. Now he has delivered them, and he's going to make many promises for them and to them, but they have a part to play as well. And so we begin in Exodus 19. God begins giving the law. We'll read this real quick. 19 verse 4 and 6 through 6. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. So that's kind of an introduction. And from here, God goes on to give the law. Now, we're skipping over quite a bit. Of course, this is the time they have encamped around Mount Sinai. God's presence comes and settles upon Mount Sinai. The mountain is enveloped in smoke, and there's rumblings and thunderings. And then we have the law. Chapter 20 is the 10 Commandments. 21 through 25 deal with some of the moral and civil laws. Chapters 26 through 31 then begin to deal with the tabernacle, its furnishings, and the priestly garments. So, first of all, there are the 10 Commandments. This is the next part of the book of Exodus that everyone is so familiar with. We'll not go through all of those at this time. I will just point out these first 4 all have to do with man's relationship with God. This is how man is related to God. And then 5 through 10 have to deal with man's relationship with man. And that sets a precedent that is true throughout the rest of Scripture. The idea that is going to be summed up later, that you love God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength as the primary commandment, and the second, that you love your neighbor as yourself. You love God and you love man, and those two things are inseparable. You can't obey, the Israelites couldn't obey the first 4 and say, well, we've taken care of loving God, and then broken the last 6, because then they wouldn't be obeying God. They go together. They are hand in hand. Now, the other thing, this is not the entirety of the law of Moses. This is a foundation. This is in some ways a summary, because God is going to go on and give more laws through the rest of the book of Exodus and throughout the book of Leviticus and also in Deuteronomy and kind of the re-giving of the law. So this is a foundation or a summary. And one last point I will make, and this is important. This is for the Israelites. You and I are not under the 10 Commandments. Now, most of the 10 Commandments, in fact, in some ways, all of them, find their way in one form or another into Christianity. It's not right to commit adultery. It's not allowable to commit adultery under the New Covenant. But that's not because it was forbidden by the law of Moses. It's because it's forbidden under the New Testament. But it is important that we recognize that this was part of the law of Moses, which has been done away with. But after the 10 Commandments, we have the rest of the law, or that's given in the book of Exodus anyway. So some of the moral and civil laws, these deals with crimes, different types of crimes, different moral issues, how certain trials were to proceed, how to deal with accidents, things like manslaughter or animals that killed somebody. There's a lot of laws about those things. There's laws about the Sabbaths and feasts. And then in chapter 24 is an important chapter because the covenant is accepted. Now, not all the law has been given, but Israel agrees to the covenant. Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord, and all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And then down in verse 8, Moses took blood and threw it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant. That should be important language because there's similar language in the New Testament referring to the cup and the fruit of the vine that is in it represents the blood of the covenant of accepting. And so there's some interesting ties there. But this is Israel accepting the covenant. They're saying we accept God's covenant. That also means that they are agreeing to do their part. And then in chapters 25 through 31, the law shifts to what might be called the ceremonial or the worship aspect. It begins to talk about how the furnishings of the tabernacle are to be created, how the tabernacle itself is to be built, how the priest garments are to be put together. And they're very intricate in their detail, but God was giving the pattern. So He has delivered the Israelites. He is now showing them how He expects them to live, and He is also showing them how He expects them to worship Him. They were not supposed to worship Him the way the Egyptians worshiped their false gods. They weren't supposed to worship Him how they deemed best. God provided the pattern. Just a couple of things. You might find this interesting. This is kind of a model of what the tabernacle might have looked like. It was a rectangular structure. Now, the tabernacle itself was a tent, and even the wall was made of posts and curtains, so it was movable. The whole thing could be packed up and moved with the Israelites. And then once they settled in Canaan, it was even able to move around. But you had a large courtyard covered with these panels. And inside, this was the brazen, or there was a brazen or a bronze altar. By the way, this would have faced to the east. It was always supposed to face to the east. And then you had the bronze or the brazen laver there, that had the waters for washing. And then you had the tabernacle proper. And within the tabernacle, there were two rooms. This first entryway was a little bit bigger, and it was called the Holy Place. And in it, you had on the north wall the table of showbread, and on the south wall, you had the lampstand, and then there was the altar of incense right between a veil that separated these two rooms. And this was a square room, and the temple is going to follow this same structure later on. But in this place, this is the Holy of Holies. It is the most holy place. And only the high priest is going to be able to enter into this room, and only once a year on the Day of Atonement. And in it is going to be placed the Ark of the Covenant. So this is the pattern for the tabernacle that God had given. These are just a couple of renditions of the priestly garments. They were intricate and beautiful garments. I gave a study a few weeks or a couple months back on the priestly garments, so we won't say too much more about that. But we have everything seeming to go well. The Israelites have been delivered. They've suffered with some complaining, but hopefully that's behind them, you would hope. And now they're receiving the law. They've accepted the covenant. With that, they now begin to learn how to build the tabernacle where they will worship God. And then we get to Exodus chapter 32. And James just spoke about this past Lord's Day a little bit, but this is the incident of the golden calf. Now, this is one of the scariest stories to me, because these are the same people that weeks earlier at most, Moses has been on the mountain for about 40 days. So a little over a month has passed since these people had literally heard the voice of God. God spoke the 10 Commandments. I don't know about you, but I would like to think that if I saw Mount Sinai or a mountain enveloped with God's presence, and I heard the voice of God, I'm sure I would have been just like the other Israelites that would have been terrified and ready to send Moses to go speak to God for me. But I'd hope that that image would stay with me and help me be obedient. It took a little over a month for these people to go and break the very first couple of laws that God's voice had uttered. Moses was taking too long for them, and so they tell Aaron to make them some gods. And Aaron goes along with the people. He has them give him their jewelry, their gold, and he melts it down, and he constructs a golden calf and says, "Here are your gods." And they worship. We don't have time to go into the rest of the story. But at this point, God tells Moses to go back down. They have rebelled, and they're now going to face the retribution of God. And Moses gets back down to the camp, and he's so angry, he throws down perhaps the most precious items that have ever been created. He held in his hand tablets of stone that God's finger wrote the commandments on. I don't know that there is another relic that could have been more valuable. And he throws them down and breaks them. He's so angry when he sees what the children of Israel are doing. And then he says, all who are on the Lord's side, come and stand by me. And all of his tribe, the tribe of Levi, comes to Moses. And he tells them to put their sword on and to go into the camp and to strike down the idolaters. And that day, at least 3,000 men of Israel are slain by their own kin because they had rebelled against God. Now that number does make me wonder if there was a good part of the nation of Israel, because again, this is a nation that numbers somewhere perhaps in the 2 to 3 millions, and only 3,000 are slain. I don't know if it was only the leaders that are slain, and that could have been a huge following then, or if maybe some of the camp sat back and didn't want any part of it. It's not explained. But it seems like it was a large part, the majority of the nation of Israel that took part in this. So 3,000 may have just been the ringleaders. But 3,000 are stricken down. And later more are going to be punished with a plague. But that's not the worst of it. God speaks to Moses, and he's ready to reject the nation. Now he's not going to give up on his promise to Abraham. Moses is a descendant of Abraham. But God tells Moses, he says, stand back and I'm going to wipe them out. And start again with Moses. He could still fulfill his promise to Abraham. But that's how angry God was. By the way, that's how angry God is when we commit idolatry. That's the type of wrath we will face on Judgment Day if we die in our sins, having made an idol of self or of the world or whatever it may be. But Moses shows the man who didn't want to go, shows one of the strongest aspects of leadership in all the Bible. And he begs God, even though he was angry with the people also, he begs God to be merciful. He begs God to remember the covenant. And Moses even says, and if you can't do that, then blot me out of your book of remembrance. He's ready to die for them. Now God says no. I think one of the reasons is because Moses, even though he was willing, wasn't fit to die for them. Because he was a sinful man too. But one day that request would be made and would be fulfilled by God himself, when his son would die in place of everyone else. But what an incredible aspect of leadership. What an incredible leader Moses proved to be. And so he requests for the people to be saved. The people do repent. And we're told that in fact, and I don't know all that there is to this, but they apparently had some ornaments. And it says that they stripped off their ornaments from Mount Horeb forward. Now that doesn't mean they're going to leave idolatry behind. They're going to suffer with it for the next several centuries. But at least these people right now, they're ready to be done with that. And with that, there is a renewal of the covenant. And then chapters 35 through 40 tell of the building of the tabernacle. And if you've gone through a reading plan this year and you've already got through this, you may have been glad to get through this part, because chapters 35 through 40 seem very strange and very tedious, because it's basically chapters 26 through 31. Except in those chapters, it was God saying, build the tabernacle this way. And then in these chapters, it's saying, and they built the tabernacle this way. And it's almost just an exact repeat of what's already been told. We think, why did they have to do this? I think there's a very significant reason why. They had been rebellious up to this point, but they've learned their lesson, at least for now. And they are obeying God. And their obedience is complete and absolute. Every detail that God told them about the tabernacle and its furnishings and the clothing and the consecration process, they follow to the letter. That's an example for us. When God tells us how He wants us to live, that's how we should live. When God tells us how He wants us to worship Him, that's how we worship Him. When God tells us how to be saved, that's how we're saved. I think that Exodus kind of drives that point home. And then when all of that's done, and the presence of God that has been over the Mount of Sinai and over the tent of meeting that Moses was at now fills the tabernacle. In the final verses there, it says, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it. And the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out. So here we have what is representing the presence of God is now in the tabernacle. And as we'll see when we get to the book of Numbers, this tabernacle was always in the middle of the camp. You had 3 tribes camped to the north, 3 to the south, 3 to the east, and 3 to the west, and the tabernacle was always in the middle. And God's presence was there. Now, when we ended the book of Genesis, we mentioned how the book of Genesis began in a paradise created by God, and it ended in a coffin in Egypt. But Exodus is almost the exact opposite. Exodus begins with the children of Israel enslaved and suffering in a foreign land. And it ends with the presence of God coming to be with His people. And that's not the end. Now God has delivered His people. He has shown them where they are to worship and how they are to worship. And now He's going to fulfill further, and He is going to give them the law so that they can know not only how to worship Him, but how they can live. And Leviticus is going to cover that, how they can be holy because their God is holy. But that brings the book of Exodus to a close and our sermon and study for the night. I hope that it's been helpful, maybe giving you some things to think about if you would like to study the book of Exodus a little bit further. As we draw the sermon to a close, perhaps there's someone here who needs to obey the gospel, and if that is the case, we would love to help you with that. If you believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God and are ready to repent of your sins and confess Him as the Son of God, then you're ready to be baptized. And if you're ready to do that, then we'd be happy to assist you with that. Or if there's a Christian who desires the prayers of the church for some reason, we'd be happy to pray with you and for you. So we'd invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.